Hey guys, and congratulations on making it to part 3. This part is a bit longer, but stick with it, as by the time you complete this section, you'll have the tentacles in there and your octophant will be taking shape. Let's create a new group called Tentacles and drag and drop in the first tentacle stock image. I chose these 3 and licensed them from Shutterstock. Please check the description for links. You can also download free samples of these tentacles from Shutterstock. As before, I'm going to convert it to a smart object. This time, rather than the pen tool, I will use Select Subject to automatically select the tentacle. This works great here as the tentacle is on solid white, and in this case gives a great result and saves us having to go around the tricky bumpy edges ourselves. I need to drop all the red tones so we can have it match our elephant colour, so I'm going to convert it into a smart object and add Camera Raw Filter. First, let's go into the colour mixer to the saturation tab and knock back all the reds. Next we can do the usual tweaks, slightly cooling down the colours and increasing the clarity and detail and reducing noise and contrast. I also slightly boosted the highlights to make it look more shiny. Save out our Camera Raw tweaks and now let's position the first tentacle. I am adjusting the rotation and scale values here to get the tentacle to the right size and in position just below the middle portion of the trunk. Next, I want to mimic the elephant's skin on the tentacle to help create the illusion it really is part of the elephant. To do this, I will sample some of the trunk by dragging a rectangular selection over a portion of the trunk and copying it with Command C. I can then go into the tentacle smart object and paste the trunk sample onto a new layer. By the way, I am also just doing a little tweak here of knocking back the magenta tones to increase the grey look even more. Since we will be using several of these to effectively texture over the tentacle skin, let's make a new group. We can't clip a whole group to the layer below it, unfortunately, so instead let's create a mask matching the tentacle shape by command clicking on the tentacle in the layer stack to create a selection matching its opaque pixels, and using this selection to create a layer mask on the group. We can now move our skin sample around and it will only be visible where the trunk is visible. Now, using the warp tool, our goal is to try and match the general shape of the trunk. We don't need to be super exact here, it can be quite rough, but as long as it matches the tentacle geometry, we will be in business. Once we are happy with the general shape, it's time to blend. First, let's double click on the skin sample layer to bring up the layer style panel. Here we can adjust the blend if grey values and of particularly the underlying layer. Essentially what this does is it enables us to allow some of the darker tones and highlights from the tentacle to bleed in over the skin. You can be experimental here and go with what works for you. Ensure you hold the Option key before dragging the slider arrow, as this will create a smooth fall off for the underlying layer tones rather than a hard edge, which won't look good. Now let's add a layer mask to the skin, and using a soft round brush set to 100% black and a low flow, let's paint onto the mask to fade out areas of the skin at the edges and gradually blend it with the tentacle. Once we like how it's looking, let's duplicate the layer within our group and position it over the lower portion of tentacle to texture. We can transform it as before using scale, rotate and warp to roughly make it match the underlying geometry. We can also paint onto its layer mask with a soft round black brush with a low flow to further blend it in. Optionally, you can experiment with different blend modes as well. I went with overlay for this and reduced the overall opacity to make it a bit more subtle. Once we're happy with the texturing of the trunk onto the tentacle, save the smart objects and go back to the main canvas. Because we are using non-destructive approaches to editing, we can easily make any adjustments later. Let's now duplicate this tentacle twice by selecting the layer and hit Command J. Position these new ones in the same way using rotate and scale and flipping horizontally so they are in the positions that you like. For this last tentacle, I'm adding a layer mask and painting onto the mask with solid black to mask out that bit of tentacle to the right of the trunk. It's also a good idea to rename the layers to keep things organised. Okay, now it's time to basically repeat this whole process for the second tentacle asset. Let's drag and drop the image and place it into our tentacles group. Convert it to a smart object and double click to edit. Let's use Select Subject again to select the tentacle so we can isolate it from the white background. This time you can see there are little areas of the white background that Select Subject is included in its selection. The easiest thing here is to quickly erase them out manually. I like to zoom in, and using either the lasso tool to select the areas or a small soft black brush, we can paint with 100% black onto the mask to get rid of these little white bits. Sometimes I temporarily add a contrasting colour adjustment layer underneath the object so I can easily see which bits to remove. I'll delete this afterwards. Just to ensure there are no stray white pixels, let's also quickly go into Select a Mask tool and reduce the Shift Edge value by about 40%. Once we are happy with our selection, let's convert it to a smart object and add our camera raw filter once again. I'm going to make the same adjustments as the previous tentacle to take out the red and orange hues and boost the texture and clarity to leave us with a nice detailed grey tentacle. Save out the smart object and let's work on positioning this new tentacle using rotate and scale. Onto the texturing then. This is the same process as the first tentacle. Using the rectangular marquee tool, drag a selection of trunk to sample and hit Command-C to copy. Double-click to edit the new tentacle smart object and create a new group for our trunk samples and paste the trunk sample onto a layer in the new group. As before, let's Command-click the trunk to select the opaque pixels, and ensuring the group is selected, click the Add Layer Mask button to create a mask from the selection. Using the same techniques as before, Transform, Rotate, Scale and the Warp tool, pull the trunk texture around so it roughly matches the geometry of the tentacle. Once happy, add a layer mask to it and using a soft round brush set to full black and a low flow, paint away the edges to blend it further. In the Layer Style panel, tweak the Blend If Gray values for the underlying layer, again making sure to Command-click the drag button before moving it, to let some of the dark and light areas of the underlying layer, the tentacle, bleed through. Repeat this process for the rest of the tentacle. 3 duplications should be enough to texture over the rest of the tentacle. So here I decided to reset the Blend If Gray values on the 4 textures we just made and actually just set them to the overall group to keep things simpler, since the values are all pretty much the same. If I want to change this later, it will be easier to do just once on the whole group rather than 4 times for each part. I also reduced the opacity slightly. I left the blend mode on normal for this one just so I can compare how it looks to the others once I start adding lighting and shadows to the octophant. Save out the smart object and duplicate it to make a second tentacle of this type. Flip it and position it into a place where you think it fits. Finally, we can perform these exact steps again for our final tentacle asset. By using 3 different assets, we can avoid too much repetitiveness for the tentacles. I will speed this up here, but the process is the same as the previous 2. This is a great moment to say that if you're enjoying this tutorial, please do click like, subscribe and hit the notification bell, as this will really help me grow the channel and make it possible for me to create more of these tutorials. Congratulations making it to the end of this rather lengthy section. We now have an almost fully formed octophant, albeit floating in midair. In the next video, we will use the Puppet Warp tool to bend the trunk around and blend in our final 8th tentacle into the trunk. See you in the next video.